Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Game Easy, Roll Good. And first thing first, I'd like to just thank you all for watching my videos over the last few days. It's been a lot of fun engaging with you guys in the comments and talking about all the different things surrounding Dungeons and Dragons. I know my wife has kind of been like, you seem a little bit happier since you started posting those videos. And I'm like, yes, it's just fun having people who share my hobbies and are able to talk about them, because I'm usually just kind of by myself here in the house, or I have my little group chat with my play group, and I kind of usually info dump on them. But having the whole world to talk to, that's pretty great. Let's start doing that. So again, thank you so much. It's been a lot of fun. I know a lot of you have been commenting on the ranged weapons video. I think has gotten a lot of chatter. I'm not expecting everyone to agree with everything I say in that video, and largely I'm mostly okay with the way that ranged weapons are now in 2024. The main thing that really bothers me is just that topple advantage versus disadvantage differential. That feels really big. If ranged weapons just had a way to ignore disadvantage against prone targets, I would be perfectly happy with the way things are. But today I wanted to talk about just a small topic here. This is going to be a bonus video on top of what I normally do. Again, I'm releasing videos every Wednesday, but this seemed like a small enough topic that I could just kind of release a video over the weekend. And again, I think just as a new creator, it might be just more important for me to kind of develop a stock of videos so that the algorithm and YouTube can figure out what I'm doing and make sure that it gets out to the right people. But we're going to be talking about oil, which I covered previously in the mundane items for the adventuring gear. I covered it in that video, and there was a line on the oil that I kind of brushed over. I don't even think I read what oil does in that video, but when I was reviewing it and I kind of read that line, I'm like, this is kind of busted, or at least very strong in the right situation. So let's go ahead and get started and see what it is that I'm talking about. So what does oil do again? So let's take a look. We're going to be focusing just on this first feature, dousing a creature or an object. And it says, when you take the attack action, you can replace one of your attacks with throwing an oil flask. Target one creature or object within 20 feet of yourself. The target must succeed a dexterity saving throw, DC 8 plus your dexterity modifier and proficiency bonus, or be covered in oil. If the target takes fire damage before the oil dries after 1 minute, the target takes an extra 5 fire damage from the burning oil. So what part of that do I think is kind of really strong? And of course, that's going to be if the target takes fire damage before the oil dries after 1 minute, the target takes an extra 5 fire damage from the burning oil. It doesn't say that the oil is consumed. So the way I'm reading this is that this is an extra 5 fire damage from any source for the next 1 minute. That's really good. And you could do this in 2014. Like, the rules around that damage existed in 2014, but the way that you applied oil to a creature was much different. It took your whole action to do it. It required a ranged attack roll with an improvised weapon. So again, you were adding your proficiency bonus to it because you probably didn't have proficiency in improvised weapons. You didn't really want to spend your whole action to do something that had such a low chance to hit in the first place. So we didn't really use it. And again, I think people probably overlook adventuring gear a lot. I know I have personally. So we probably didn't even know that it did this in the first place. But now that we do, and it's much easier to apply because it's not only a saving throw, but it only takes the place of one attack and not our whole action. This is a much more legitimate strategy. But we might be concerned that fire is a very common resistance. So of course, we might be like, well, I don't know if it's going to be useful in this fight, but you kind of do. And you do know both in character and out of character. But most importantly, you know in character usually when fire damage is going to be good, because within at least the 2014 Monster Manual, we're not including every creature. I don't have that spreadsheet in front of me. But within the 2014 Monster Manual, there's 692 creatures total. 144 of them are either resistant or immune to fire, which is about 21%, or about 1 in 5. And of those 144, 83 of them are fiends, which is about 60%. 14 are elementals, 13 are dragons, 11 are undead, and then there's just a smattering of other creatures where it's like there's maybe 5, and there's a bunch of them that have 1 that's like immune or resistant to fire. Not really worth focusing on those, but what we can see is that the vast majority of creatures that are resistant or immune to fire are fiends, which makes sense. We know going into the 9 hells that facing demons and devils probably shouldn't be using fire damage, so in character you would know that probably. Elementals, if you're looking at a fire elemental, you're not going to be using fire damage. That's a pretty safe assumption. I think there might be some water elementals that are resistant to fire, but the point here isn't to metagame and figure out which monster is immune or resistant to which, but it's just to show that if you're going against a dragon and the dragon is breathing fire, you shouldn't be using fire damage. And your character, even with an 8 intelligence, you're smart enough to know that. Undead, I don't think there's any real patterns. I don't know, if there's an easy way to tell which type of undead would be immune or resistant to fire. But for the vast majority, for fiends, elementals, and dragons, you know that you shouldn't be using fire against certain ones, right? Pretty much all fiends don't use it. Against fire elementals, don't use it. Against dragons breathing fire, don't use it. Outside of that, fire is good to go. Of course, this doesn't include spells that grant fire resistance or immunity. Doesn't include magic items that grant fire resistance or immunity. But just looking at a creature, your character in character knows kind of generally when fire will be good and when it won't. And additionally, it's usually also obvious when a dexterity saving throw, because it is a dex save, using your dex bonus. So again, dex classes are very happy to be doing this if they have ways to take advantage of it. It's usually obvious when a dexterity saving throw is in our favor, because we can look at a big lumbering creature and be like, that thing is probably not very dexterous. It probably has maybe a 0 to dex. It's probably, doesn't even have a dex saving throw if we're just kind of thinking in our head. And then there's, very slow creatures, even if they're small, very slow creatures or creatures that are fixed in place, kind of like a brain in a jar or something like that. Those probably have negative or just, non-existent dex saves. So we know that it's going to be very reliable in those cases. But if it's a very fast creature, very agile creature, we know, okay, this creature is probably, has a much higher dex bonus, more likely to have a dexterity saving throw bonus with their proficiency. So I'm less likely to land it here. So it's more of a risk for me to do it at this time. But in certain situations where against big, slow creatures, you're like, I can probably reliably land this, and it's not going to be that hard to do. So when I discovered this, I was like, okay, well, how do I use this? If I really wanted to get the most out of this, how would I do it? And since I was in the adventuring gear at the time, I was like, oh, of course, the torch, right? Because the torch was changed to be a simple melee weapon that deals 1 fire damage. It always dealt 1 fire damage in 2014, but now it's considered a simple melee weapon, which is specifically good for monks because it counts as a monk weapon then. And then you can replace the 1 fire damage with your martial arts weapon die, and that becomes fire damage. So it's basically a quote-unquote free 1 hour of attacking with fire damage, since you have to light the torch. I'm like, okay, that's pretty specific. Like, we're fighting with the torch. Monks are the only ones that can really take advantage of it. Technically, I guess anyone could, hit with a torch, but they're only dealing 1 damage. So who cares if you're doing an extra 5 damage? But then I remembered, okay, monks can actually do this even better by going with the Warrior of the Elements monk, right? So the Warrior of the Elements monk in 2014 was kind of a joke. It's trying to kind of be the sort of pseudo spellcaster, but didn't really do anything well. It's changed quite a bit in 2024. This is the first feature that they get at level 3. It's called Elemental Attunement. We're going to read the first line before we get down to the highlighted text. It says, at the start of your turn, you can spend 1 focus point, which is key points, but in 2024, they're called focus points, to imbue yourself with elemental energy. The energy lasts for 10 minutes or until you have the incapacitated condition. You gain the following benefits while this feature is active. So immediately we can see that this requires no action economy to initiate. It's just at the start of your turn, you spend a focus point, you say, I'm going to start dealing fire damage with my unarmed strikes now. Then you have elemental strikes. It says, whenever you hit with your unarmed strike, you can cause it to deal your choice of acid, cold, fire, lightning, or thunder damage rather than its normal type. So this lasts for 10 minutes. It removes your dependency on the torch. And not only does it remove dependency on the torch, but because it's specifically affecting your unarmed strikes, it now extends to flurry of blows. So a level 5 Warrior of the Elements monk is dealing up to 4 attacks per turn, 3 to 4 attacks, 2 with their attack action, 1 to 2 with their bonus action, 1 from the regular bonus action unarmed strike, or 2 additional from the flurry of blows. So that's up to 20 damage, additional damage every round, just from having a target covered in oil while dealing fire damage. It's going to be 15 damage possible at the first turn when you spend 1 attack to try to cover them in oil. But once they are, it's just, you just unload on them and you're dealing a bunch of extra damage. It's basically the equivalent of Great Weapon Master, but specifically for monks, because monks can really take advantage of this. So that's pretty powerful, even if it is sort of situational. But I think it's, in most cases, this is a pretty valid strategy for this specific subclass. But then it's like, okay, let's think of outside of monks. Well, what are some spells that deal fire damage that might be pretty powerful? So we're going to take a look at spells real quick. This isn't every fire damage spells. I just kind of wanted to put some standouts. As we get to the end, there's just less and less spells in general. But cantrips, we've got Firebolt, Green Flame Blade, Sorceress Burst, which is a new sorcerer cantrip, Chromatic Orb, Hellish Rebuke, and Searing Smite at level 1. Now, anything with an asterisk next to it means that it has the ability to repeat fire damage more than once each time you cast it. So Searing Smite, for example, deals fire damage immediately, and then at the beginning of each of that creature's turns, it has to make a saving throw, and if it fails, then it takes more fire damage. Flame Blade, Heat Metal, of course, Scorching Ray can give you a lot of burst in one turn if a target is covered in oil. Elemental Weapon and Flame Arrows at level 3 is kind of a standout. Normally, I wouldn't take these spells even on classes that can get them, because it requires your whole action to use them. And Elemental Weapon does last an hour, but it is concentration as well. And there's so many things that can come up that can interrupt your concentration, or maybe you want to cast Guidance and you're a ranger with Guidance somehow, and you want to cast that, but that requires your concentration. But if you're planning around this specific interaction of someone's going to splash oil on a creature and I just want to be able to deal fire damage on each of my attacks, Elemental Weapon or Flame Arrows are both good ways to do that. Fireball, of course, Mel's Minute Meteors has repeatable damage. 4th level, Conjure Minor Elementals, which is broken in itself. Fire Shield, if a creature is covered in oil and then attacks you. Wall of Fire. And then, as you get to these 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, and level spells, the 5 fire damage that you're getting from the target covered in oil isn't the big, we're not casting it for that reason. They do a lot of damage on their own, and that's why we're casting them. The 5 extra damage is just whatever. If we're wanting to take advantage of that extra 5 fire damage, we're probably just going to upcast a Scorching Ray or something like that, right? But that's spells, right? So let's look at what are some class features. Are there other classes that can take advantage of this extra fire damage from having a target covered in oil? So if we look at the Barbarian, we have the Desert Aura from the Storm Herald. We have the Divine Strike from the Cleric of the Forge Domain. We have the Wildfire Spirit from the Wildfire Druid. Specifically the Fire Rune from the Rune Knight on the Fighter. That's a limited resource, but that deals fire damage repeatedly as they're bound in that Fire Rune. The Monk actually has an entire other subclass, the Ascendant Dragon, that also can just deal fire damage on each of their unarmed strikes. So the Monk has 2 subclasses that can just unload with oil and then just do a bunch of damage and have 5 extra damage on all of their attacks. So that's pretty crazy. The Ranger, the Drake Companion for the Drake Warden, can deal extra fire damage. And I believe they can actually put fire damage on other people's attacks once per turn as well. So that's another thing to keep in mind. The Warlock, the Genie's Wrath for the Genie Patron Warlock, specifically the Fire Genie, can do fire damage at least once per turn. And then Artificer, the Artillerist, has the Flamethrower Cannon. And then if you happen to be using the Blood Hunter, which is specifically the Critical Role specific subclass, if your DM is allowing that, the base class has the Crimson Right feature, which gives you extra fire damage on all of your attacks when you have that Crimson Right active. So we can see that most classes have some way to deal extra fire damage. Not most of these are pretty limited or very small amounts of. It's like once per turn. I don't think any of these are really happening more than once per turn, except for the Blood Hunter specifically, and of course the Monk. And we can see that the Bard isn't here, the Paladin isn't here. Of course, they have spells that can deal fire damage, but they have no class feature specifically that deal extra fire damage. So let's move on from there. I think we're going to move on to our final thoughts here. So again, this is a very, very powerful combo, especially if you have multiple sources of fire damage in the party. It does require one of your attacks to try to get it to land, but once it lands, it only really takes 2 triggers of that fire damage to make up for that attack. And then anything beyond that is just profit, essentially, right? It's very cheap at 1 silver, so you can just carry around so many flasks of oil. If you have your bag of holding, you can just fill that up with flasks of oil. It is a little situational, like I mentioned before. It's not going to be for campaigns, encounters, or adventure arcs that primarily feature fire-resistant immune enemies. It's not going to be, as useful against creatures that have very high dex bonuses because they're more likely to make that saving throw, so it's more of a risk to do it. And then we saw that outside of the Ascendant Dragon and the Elements Monk, most classes have a hard time of getting a lot out of this on a per turn basis without expending a pretty significant resource, such as upcasting a Scorching Ray or anything along those lines. Or they have to use like a third level spell slot on Elemental Weapon or Flame Arrows, or they have to take those specific spells as well. But monks are going to love this because, again, every buff in 2024, no matter what it is, if it's about adventuring gear or whatever, it seems to be just a massive buff for monks. 2024, when they were designing this book and their stand-up meetings, they're like, how do we buff monks today? We're talking about adventuring gear. How about we give Oil the ability to do more fire damage, and then we'll give the monk the ability to do fire damage on all their attacks. Sounds great. Let's do it, right? So let me know what you think of this in the comments. It is pretty strong. I would probably suggest, try not nerfing this right away. I would, if your party is going to do this, this is something you can discuss in session 0. If you're like, hey, what are you guys thinking about doing? Are there certain strategies that you're kind of wanting to build around, anything like that? And if they mention this one, they can be like, okay, I just need to add a little more health to certain important targets just to make sure that they can't just, kill this one so quickly that the combat isn't that fulfilling, right? That way they can have their fun. The combat lasts basically as long as you intended it to in the first place, and everyone's happy. So again, let me know what you think about that in the comments. While you're going down to those comments, please hit that like button. If you liked this video, please hit that subscribe button. Again, I have a new video coming out this Wednesday. New videos every Wednesday, and I might throw out bonus videos here and there as I find certain cool, interesting things like this. But again, I appreciate your guys' time. I appreciate you guys watching this video, and I'll see you next time.